Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of In Lay Terms. Today with us is Mr. Trevor Holsworth. How are you doing?
Good, thanks, Payman. Nice to be here on your show.
It's good. It's good to finally put a face to the name. You and we had a brief conversation over the phone. I'm very pleased to have you on the show. You have a fantastic story. Before we get to that, maybe if you could give the audience just a brief background on who you are and how you got involved.
Sure. Well, like a lot of Canadians, my experience with the legal system is pretty limited. We interact with the legal system maybe once or twice in our life, hopefully less than that. But I went through a divorce and I encountered a lawyer committing fraud, and I tried to deal with the fraud and bring it to the lawyer's attention, and he refused to deal with it. So I brought it to the attention of a judge, and I brought the transcript to prove the fraud. And the judge protected the lawyer committing fraud by calling up the plaintiff, my ex-wife, and asking her what she had heard a judge say in a previous hearing and preferring that to the transcript. And so I took those two pieces of information to the Law Society and to the Canadian Judicial Council, and they all protected the lawyer and the judge against the citizen of Canada. And I let it lie for quite a few years. And then I decided that I would confront the issue because I really had no rights if I had no ability to disclose corruption and fraud in a legal system. So I did that, and I call myself Fundamental Justice on .com on the websites, and then on Twitter I go by Rule of Law Canada.
All right, Trevor. So it's a fascinating story, and you've been in that world for the last few years, so you understand the terminology and the lexicon. For the rest of us, let's assume that nobody understands what all these legal terms mean, and I've prepared a series of slides. Let's go through this one step at a time. Can you see my screen?
Oh yeah, there I am. Yep, perfect. Yeah, that's the handle. Thanks, Payman.
Yeah, you're going to get a whole bunch of followers, either supportive or haters, but you'll get a lot of followers.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation. Nobody wants to know that our legal system is corrupt or dysfunctional because we need it and we want to trust it. But we need to call truth to power when things go too far out of sync with Canadian values. So that's what I'm attempting to do.
No, you're doing great work. So first things first, I noticed that you have a Substack article. After we got off the phone yesterday or the day before, I was going through your article, and it basically details what you just told the audience. The first thing I wanted to convey to the audience, a court order, that's basically the judge's ruling, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And when you say the lawyer created a fraudulent court order, he basically forged it, changed it, lied about it?
Yeah, he manipulated what the judge said, hoping that I wouldn't catch it. And at the time, I was self-represented. And I caught the lie, and I called him on it, and he tried to just shuffle it off.
So basically, it would be like if the judge said, Trevor is a tax-paying citizen, and he changed it to Trevor is not a tax-paying citizen.
Yeah, he added on a few items to make it in his favor. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to shift the balance in his favor significantly.
And suffice it to say, if you or I did that, we'd probably go to jail.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So the other thing I wanted to ask, okay, so you asked him to correct the error, but he refused. So I'm assuming he refused because if he did that, he would have to admit the error?
No, I think he just wanted to just have power over me, really. I mean, at first I just drew his attention to it, and then he shuffled it off, and then I got the clerk's notes from the registry office, and that they kind of take shorthand notes of what goes on, and I submitted that to him. and he still ignored me. So I just, sometimes people pull bluffs on you, right? And they try to get away with things. And sometimes you just got to keep on following through on correct procedure. And so I did that, and I brought the transcript in.
Okay, so he basically lied. He submitted falsified documents, and you went and got the original documents.
Correct.
So this goes over what you just said. You provided the original documents to the judge. The judge called the plaintiff at the time. It was your ex-wife. Just again, if people don't understand, in these cases, you have a plaintiff that brings the case, and then you have the guy who has to defend himself. In this case, that's you, the defense.
Exactly. Yeah, and then I end up spending, the last 2 or 3 years basically researching the law on this topic, and read a significant amount and did a significant amount of research. And I knew basically I was confronting the entire legal system. So I kind of wanted to do it right.
This was me before I knew, I didn't realize the plaintiff was your ex-wife. So that's why I asked that here. So the judge called the plaintiff to the stand, and then you say he requested perjury to protect the lawyer's fraud and preferred the testimony over the transcript. So basically, instead of taking the transcript from his own clerks, he called your ex-wife to the stand, and then your ex-wife, did she lie, or what happened?
Yeah, well, she protected her lawyer. So the problem really is, as I went to the court, I said, I don't know if the bias of the judge was to protect the lawyer committing fraud, to protect the plaintiff who brings the business to the court, or just because she's a woman. But I know it's wrong. My children know it's wrong. Every Canadian knows that it's wrong. The transcript is the best evidence that you can have, particularly to protect yourself against fraud on a court order. So that's what the transcript is for, is to verify what the judge said or what the parties said, what everyone said. It's the official court record.
Okay, so the judge does this. There's not much you can do if you're in his courtroom or her courtroom. So you escalate it to the Canadian Judicial Council. What happens next?
So the Canadian Judicial Council claimed that it was within the discretion of a judge to accept or reject the transcript. And therefore, it is not, it's not judicial conduct, which is a very curious position to take, that judges can, it's a claim of absolute power, that they can decide any evidence, and that their word is better than the transcript, better than any evidence that any Canadian can provide. So I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to handle the situation. What do you do when the highest authority tells you that you're wrong? So then I kind of suggested them that they should rethink it, and they declined. And then I was sort of stuck with that. I wrote to the Minister of Justice at the time, and he said, I can't do anything about it. You have to go back to the Judicial Council. However, that's not quite the truth, as we'll come to find out a little bit later.
Going a step back, what is the Canadian Judicial Council?
So in 1971, there was a case of a judge who was alleged to have misconduct. And there wasn't really a process that Parliament had set up to investigate judicial misconduct. And so they did it through Parliament, and they did it through a bunch of other inquiries and stuff like that. And it ended up being a real disaster. And so after that, they decided to create this Canadian Judicial Council, where they would have judges judging judicial conduct. Because there's kind of a sense that you don't want to have too much interference from outside people like the executive influencing judges. So they want to kind of externalize it a little bit. But judging judges doesn't really work because they're partial to themselves. They tend to protect themselves. So I've got some ideas on reform, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later too.
And we didn't talk about this before. I'm just reading this down at the bottom of the screen. The Canadian Judicial Council is the National Council of Judiciary of Canada. Do you know if it's under the executive branch or the judicial branch?
It's under the judicial branch. I mean, it's an act of Parliament. So, I mean, I guess theoretically it's a branch of Parliament or something, but it's a statute within the Judges Act that creates the council, and then they create rules and regulations to govern their conduct. But their mandate is to judge judicial conduct, and they have a series of different procedures and rules. And basically, somewhere here I've got, this is the rule basically of judicial conduct. Is the conduct alleged so manifestly and profoundly destructive of the concept of impartiality, integrity, and independence of the judicial role that public confidence would be sufficiently undermined to render the judge incapable of executing the judicial office?
Do you think that's the bar is set too high, or do you think it's too vaguely worded, or do you think it's adequate?
I think it's a very good description of what we want from judicial conduct. And this conduct that I'm alleging, I think fits right in there like a dirty shirt, right? Because you have fraud being protected by a judge. So it's clearly partial, clearly destructive of the concept of impartiality, and it definitely lacks integrity. And it's obviously biased towards a lawyer. It's just so wrong. No Canadian will stand for it. So for the Judicial Council to go that way, they're clearly not following their mandate. The next section of the rule is even better. Judicial independence exists for the benefit of the judged, not the judges. It is therefore to be assessed from the perspective of the reasonable observer and in light of the public interest it is meant to serve. So the legal system is there for us, citizens. It's meant to serve our needs to access justice. It's not there for the judges to collect a paycheck or for lawyers to screw their clients. It's there to get peace, order, and good government for Canadians, which is the constitutional imperative, the constitutional requirement for government. It has to serve the public.
So I believe on the topic of scumbag lawyers, next you talk about the BC Law Society. What happened? What are they? What are they supposed to do? And what happened when you escalated to them?
Sure. So the BC Law Society is another act of Parliament. This one is the act of the BC legislature. Like all the other law societies, they're governed by the provincial legislatures, and they're a creature of a statute of the provincial legislature. And they give a monopoly on the provision of legal services to lawyers on the basis that they will protect the public interest. That's why we have regulations. That's why we have the law, is to protect the public. So when I went to the Law Society and made my complaint, and they started investigating, and they took it very seriously. And then all of a sudden, the lawyer that was dealing with it kind of disappeared, and I had another lawyer appeared, and she basically just sort of pushed it all off, and a change in the whole tactics took place. Even though the lawyer admitted in writing to not complying with a court order to provide monthly trust account statements, which was another of the complaints that I had, and we had this other issue with him creating this fraudulent court order, what they did was they didn't send it to their investigation committee. They collected evidence and took out evidence, submitted it to the benchers, which are like the senior lawyers in the Law Society, and asked them what we should do with it. But they deleted all the evidence that was incriminating. And so the benchers said, no, let's just shuffle it away. There's no problem here. And then they wrote to me and said, okay, we've dismissed it. And I was like, well, how are you protecting the public? And and then I asked for written reasons, and they refuse to provide them. And the written reasons are part of their statutory requirement. That's how they justify their conduct. And they refuse to provide me written reasons. So I complained to the BC Ombudsman, and the BC Ombudsman took about a year to try to negotiate with the BC Law Society, and eventually said, well, the Law Society is just refusing to do it, and there's nothing we can do about it. And that was the end of the matter.
Man, what a nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that the BC Law Society or the province gives monopoly to lawyers to provide legal services. Do you mean like there was a time when they didn't have a monopoly?
No, I think it's pretty much been more or less all the time. I think in our, I'm not sure when they got the monopoly, but it's been that way for a long, long time. All of the history of Canada, for certain. And, you know, it works well if we have access to a rule of law where lawyers are judging their own conduct correctly, and we can go to a lawyer and get good legal advice. But if you can't trust a lawyer to give you legal advice, and you can't trust the Law Society to discipline lawyers committing fraud and not following court orders, then we really have no need for lawyers because they're not fulfilling their public duty.
I understand. Trevor, I'm going to ask you a question. I didn't talk to you about this before, so you might not be prepared to answer it, but Bill 36 went through one of the provisions of Bill 36, even if you don't know anything about it. You have the College of Physicians. The NDP government in BC amalgamated that, and now all or most of the people who sit on that board are appointed by the government, and now they want to do the same thing with the BC Law Society. Do you think this is a good thing, a bad thing, or do you have an alternative suggestion?
You know, so yeah, I've heard about this, and the problem is if you have government being involved controlling lawyers, then lawyers aren't really independent. They're kind of arms of the government. And that's the concern that lawyers have, and it's the concern that public have, is how can you have an independent legal advice if they're governed by the government? They're going to be following the government's rule. So my reform idea is to place a jury of citizens on top of the Judicial Conduct Board and on top of the Law Society Board and probably in the Ethics Commissioner in Parliament, and put the people of Canada on top of the pyramid of power to judge those that purport to judge in our interest so that we can properly protect our interests.
Good answer. All right. I guess moving on, what do we got next? Parliament. You escalated it to Parliament. Can you talk to how Parliament fits into this, the policing, the judiciary, as well as the power to remove judges?
Sure. Yeah. So, Parliament created, Parliament's governed, well, the Parliament, the executive, and the judiciary are all governed, and the people of Canada, in a way, are all governed by the terms of our Constitution. And so Parliament, the Constitution, Section 99 gives Parliament the important role of dismissing a judge for failure to do his duty. And it's not something that is done lightly, because you don't want to have judiciary controlled by the executive and doing what they want. You want to have an independent judiciary, but you also want to have a judiciary that is in compliance with the Constitution and Canadian values and respects the public and those kind of things. So Parliament has the right to remove a judge. And so when the Canadian Judicial Council failed to do their role, I started writing to Parliament, and I wrote to the Attorney General of Canada to start off the process, and I requested that he protect my rights with Section 24, the enforcement procedure of the Charter, and I requested that he bring this matter up to Parliament and have Parliament debate it properly and investigate the conduct. Should judges have a discretion in their acceptance of the best evidence that any Canadian could provide, the official court record, the transcript. And I submitted that to the Attorney General, the Minister of Justice, David Lametti, and they ignored it.
Shocker.
Just ignored it. They didn't want to know about it. They didn't want Canadians to know about it. They just want it shut down.
What about this other section? I'm just going to read this verbatim, so I don't stumble over my words. Section 24 of the Charter reads, anyone whose rights or freedoms as guaranteed by this Charter are infringed you can apply it to a court of competent jurisdiction. And you mentioned the only court was the Parliament. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure what to speak to that, but that, Parliament has the constitutional right to dismiss a judge. No other place. And Parliament is a court. It's the highest court in the land. And so, judges cannot remove themselves. They can retire, but the Canadian Judicial Council cannot remove a judge. They are just an investigative body, and they don't replace the Minister of Justice, who actually has the duty to do this job. The role of the Minister of Justice is to protect the public and ensure that the administration of government is, you got that coming up, okay, is in compliance with the law. So the Minister of Justice has the responsibility to bring to the attention of Parliament problems with the administration of justice and ask. Parliament's the people's house, right? That's the representative of the people. So Parliament is supposed to protect the public interest in this relationship. So that's Parliament's role. And then Parliament would pass it, the Senate would pass it, and the Governor General would pass it. Then the judge would be dismissed.
Okay. I think, is that the RCMP? There was also an incident. The RCMP was involved?
Right. I mean, so I just started searching around for all my options and all the different people I could communicate with, and I just wrote letters to them all. But I started writing to the RCMP National Division, which is tasked with investigating corruption in members of Parliament. And I started off and just very slowly built into my case, and I disclosed the fact that the Minister of Justice wasn't responding to the enforcement procedure of the Charter, which is a breach of the law. It's a breach of our Constitution, and they end up saying, "Do not send more evidence. We will not investigate it. We will destroy it." And this was all going on right when the Capitol building was being overrun in the States. I was watching TV, watching riots go on in Washington, D.C. as people are doing this. And I'm writing to the RCMP alleging corruption in the Minister of Justice. And they're telling me that they're going to destroy my evidence. And it's like, wow, I was just floored.
You're not the first person that said that. I had, I don't know if you know Regina Wattiel. She's talking about fraud in the Parliament with regard to the scientific modeling. And she had the same problem. Like she went up every single chain that she could until she finally got to the RCMP. And it's almost like every institution that's there to protect us is just refusing to cooperate, not interested. I don't know what you want to call it.
Yeah. I mean, I saw that interview that you did with Wattel there, and that was an amazing interview. And she has done some amazing work. And the parallels are the same. The problem comes from the idea of the concept of in the separation of powers, that you should have the judiciary and the executive and Parliament all checking each other's powers, and that they should be making sure that no one is breaking the Constitution, no one is doing the wrong thing, right? That's Parliament is supposed to check the executive and supposed to check the judiciary. Judiciary is supposed to check Parliament and the executive. They're all checking each other. But what we're seeing is a complete failure, that all of those institutions are protecting themselves instead of the public.
I've just reminded of something you said to me, which I thought actually was pretty profound. you gave a pecking order. You said like the judges absolutely protect themselves, and then they like protecting the lawyers. Every once in a while, they throw a bone to the public by going after corrupt cops, and then they absolutely slaughter the citizens.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about that this morning. Because you think about, lawyers are kind of bullies, and judges are kind of bullies, and police are bullies. Everyone bullies people below them in power structures, right? So, we have these people that have more power than us. They tend to bully us because they have more power. But when you're alleging problems above you, you can't bully. Then you're whistleblowing, right? Then you're trying to call for the public's attention or for someone's attention to bring attention to this matter. But like Wattel found, nobody wanted to hear her story. Same thing, nobody wants to hear my story. The judges don't want to hear it. The lawyers don't want to hear it. And in a way, the public doesn't want to hear it because we would rather believe that the system works than face the truth that it doesn't and that we have a massive problem on our hands.
That kind of goes into another question that I had, and we talked about this briefly before the episode, how you've been at this since about 2016, and it was just an uphill battle. But then after 2019 with COVID, people have started apparently questioning all of these things.
Yeah, we had a shift either a shift in the consciousness of Canadians of what was happening above them, or we've had a shift in the relationship of power above us, where they've decided that they're going to abuse us. I'm not sure exactly which one, and there's probably a mix of it all going on, but we're definitely seeing a change in the relationship between those that purport to govern us and the governed.
Does that? We're still on your Substack article. You also kicked it up to the Ethics Commission. Can you speak to that?
I was just watching something on SNC Lavalin, and I kind of was like, maybe I'll make a report to the Ethics Commissioner and try to connect in with Parliament. And so I started communicating with the Ethics Commissioner, and at the start they wanted to have nothing to do with it, and I just pointed out the problem, and eventually they accepted my complaint, but I had never heard another word. I contacted them again about a year later, no response. The commissioner ended up retiring, Commissioner Dion, and he was like, I just can't do my job anymore. There's just too much ethical violations, and I quit.
I'm going to ask the audience to forgive me if I forget the names, but we have the Ethics Commissioner's Office, we have the BC Law Society, and whatever that was, the Council of Judges. These are internal policing bodies, correct?
That's correct.
I'm noticing a trend here. They all fail.
Yeah, and we're seeing that right across the board as we go through all these public complaints commissions with the COVID inquiry, and we're starting. The attention of the public is becoming quite intense in examining the conduct of our officials, and we're seeing problems.
People are getting involved.
Yeah.
This is just like this is like a follow-up question. It's just a general one, though. Like, does the judiciary outside of the Council of Judges, does it have any authority to police itself or regulate itself?
Well, I mean, they rely on the public trust. So really, like we talked about before, they rely on the public accepting their authority. That's where their authority comes from originally, is that we consent to their rule. There's, sorry, I'm just going to look at, I got a list of things here somewhere that have all the roles of the judges. But what they say, talk about the public values of the judiciary are reason, justification, that they produce a reason why they're making a decision, that they are in charge of creating a fair process to both parties, impartiality, that they're not biased towards one party, that they're independent, that they're not being influenced by the executive or by outside sources or being bribed or whatever, transparency, that we have access to so that the decisions of the court, the way that they made their decisions, the transcripts, all that kind of stuff, accountability, that they are responsible for the decisions, representation. We want to have a judiciary that represents the public, and efficient. We want decisions brought in reasonably quickly and within our budget.
So,
public values.
That's a good comprehensive list. Trevor, I might be skipping a little bit ahead, but another thing we talked about was this transfer of power from the jury to the judiciary, to the point where now judges are like executive legislators, legislating, creating laws out of nothing. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Well, I mean, judges have always done that in a way. They've refined the law. Parliament enacts a law, and then the judiciary end up filling in the blanks. Every time they make a decision, they are kind of filling in the gray areas of what the statutes say. So they've always done that. With the Charter of Rights, then they saw an expanded role. 1982, the judges all of a sudden were judging a constitution that, the Charter of Rights, and that they saw as a great big expansion in their powers, that they had this role to enforce the Constitution, and they took it on, and it expanded the powers of the judiciary substantially, and people respected the judiciary for their role in that expansion. I'm not sure if, and then the jury, right. What at the same time, the jury system has been sliding downwards. Funding for the jury system has gone down. Basically, the public is expected to volunteer as jury. Everyone else in the justice system is well paid, but the public, they get paid like $30 a day or less than $100 a day for jury duty. It's like, it's an important role, and we treat it like it's just, has no respect, and people want to get away from it because it's so disrespected financially. Instead of going, hey, we need you to be a juror, and we're going to pay you well for it, and we need you to do this job. But so I think it's been on purpose, because if they can remove the public out of the process, then they control the process. And that's ultimately, everybody wants to have more power, and the judges and the lawyers are the same, politicians are the same. The responsibility of the public is to check their power. That's our role as a citizen, is to make sure that our officials don't overstep their boundaries. But we're Canadians, we tend to let them get away with it. And I think now Canadians are like, no, this is not okay.
We've had enough.
We've had enough, yeah.
Picking up on what you said about 1982, the Charter, prior to the Charter coming in, the court still had presumably some limited discretion to see if Act of Parliament violated the then Constitution, correct?
Yeah, they've always had that role. I think the Charter basically just expanded it and legitimized it and created it as a specific function that Parliament was giving to the judiciary. But it was always there.
Okay, so it basically just got blown up, expanded, as you said. Yeah.
Expanded, yeah.
The next thing I wanted to ask you about is I'm also like, I'm educating myself. I'm trying to understand these things. You go through life, you watch enough Hollywood movies, it's beaten into you that you have the three branches of government: legislature, executive, and judiciary. And there's a separation. And then you look into it, and we have executive courts, like the Human Rights Commission, and now with Bill 63. How is the public so accepting of these things that are contrary to what we thought was reality?
I think they just don't know. It's just a lack of knowledge. We have very limited engagement with these tribunals. There is a book out called Unjust by Design, and it is about the administrative law tribunals in Canada. And it was written about 10 years ago by a lawyer, and basically saying, look, these systems are just completely wrong, and they're not functional, and they're not providing justice to Canadians. What the problem is with administrative tribunals is that they're executive tools. They're staffed by members of the government, and they're dispensing policy of the government. They're not dispensing fair and impartial trials. They're dispensing official government policy. And that's the difference, supposedly, between administrative law tribunals and the legal system, although it gets very murky when you realize that the Minister of Justice and the Prime Minister appoint every single judge in Canada. The only difference is that judges are harder to remove, so they tend to stay in power after the different governments. But for instance, right now in Canada, 75% of judges have been appointed by the Liberal Party, and a majority of the judges on the Supreme Court of Canada have been appointed by the Liberal Party. And so now you see a blurring of that separation of powers. You have judges being appointed by the executive, and who is beholden to who, and the Ministry of Justice can fire them too by appealing to Parliament. And they have the majority in Parliament. So by definition, if the Minister of Justice wants someone gone, they're gone.
That is a good point. I've been thinking about that lately because of our parliamentary system. Like whoever has a majority government is guaranteed to have the prime minister as well, the executive.
And that's, it worked in the past when you had sort of more independent parliamentarians. But these days, with the party system being so dominant, and the prime minister, the prime minister doesn't exist in the Constitution. It's a creation of the party system. And the party system says we want to have a leader to our party. And then they control who becomes parliamentarians. You cannot get elected in the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party unless you have the approval of the party leader. So then you go to Parliament, and you also rely on the funds to get elected, which is a problem because you have money influencing politics. That always has problems. But so in order to get elected, you have to have the approval of the prime minister. You get access to their funding. You get elected. You're going to do what they say, or you're not going to get elected again.
Now that I have you here, getting some free information from you, I read the Constitution Act, 1867. It doesn't mention anything about the Prime Minister's office. When was it created? Was that created by an act of Parliament?
I'll have to look into it a little bit more. I don't really have an answer to that. I think it's, I don't know I think it's just a convention that's just being practiced. And I don't think has any legitimacy through an act of Parliament or anything like that. It's just how the party leaders and the party politics goes.
Yeah, what's really astounding is if you read that entire Constitution, not only does it not mention the Prime Minister, it doesn't mention anything about the executive. It's just purely the Parliament and the Governor General and the courts.
Yeah.
I guess my next question, you mentioned that our involvement with the courts is increasing. It's increased since the 70s, and that's one of the reasons that Canadians might be waking up and taking more notice of the court system. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So, lawyers are expensive. And so in the past, like 100 years ago, the only people that really used lawyers were the rich. And the common people just sort of had to fend for themselves, or the police basically would distribute justice to the common people. I think the big change in the involvement of the public, before that, it was basically just the criminal law system, and then a little bit of contracts and a little bit of this, if you're in business and or had some kind of disputes, but there were pretty minor involvements. But with the Family Law Act coming in, and with the increasing divorce rates, where now you've got 50% of people getting divorced, it means that the entire population of Canada is, at some point in time, is engaging with the legal system. So you had a massive number of new lawyers coming in. A lot of them are also operating as sole practitioners, so they have no one checking their work. You just have one person practicing, and so it's basically their ethics as to what they do as being acceptable or not. But I think that's the big change in the access to people is just the intrusion of law into our general lives and into our management of our affairs and all sorts of things like that. So.
I had actually another question I forgot to ask you regarding the appointment of judges. You said it's purely the discretion of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice. What's your solution to fix that?
I haven't thought about that a whole lot. It might be better in a way if the law societies were to do it, or I really haven't given it a whole lot of thought, but I just sort of realized in the last couple of months how much control the executive does have over the judiciary, and how that is a problem for independence and separation of powers. But I haven't really thought too much about the solution on that issue.
This is just something that came to me right now as well, so you don't have to answer it. But I wonder if the Prime Minister having the authority to appoint all the judges made sense prior to 1982 when the judiciary's role was smaller.
Well, I think it's just, it's all historically based. I mean, in the past, the reason we have judges is because historically, if the peasants had a complaint, they went to their local lord and in the feudal system, right, and asked for a solution. And then they would maybe appeal to the king. And as people's concerns got larger, or the demands on the king got larger, he started appointing deputies basically to be judges to take off his role. And that's how the system started. And then the people were like, well, how is this fair when they're employees of yours? So we want a different system. So, it's been evolving, but really it hasn't changed since that initial, they are the king's representatives. And they've been trying to hide that reality by claiming independence and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is that's their origins, and the structure of power is still that way. So it's sort of problematic, but we haven't really changed and hadn't thought about solutions to that one.
Well, Trevor, I guess I have one last question, and this is the development that happened last night. And the reason I look so tired is because I was up all night on Twitter. Brazil's judiciary is clamping down. Have you been following the news?
I just saw something from Musk talking about him saying that the judicial system in Brazil is corrupt or something, and I haven't really gotten into it too detail, but tell me more.
Again, I'm going based on what Schellenberger said, but there's this judge he's bringing suits against these citizens. They're coming into his courtroom and he's just throwing them in jail So the argument is that they're I don't, usual insurrection or whatever, but it's a censorship push. And the reason I ask it is, like, do you see parallels between everything that's going on in the world? Like Bill 63, Europe has its own censorship law, Scotland, Ireland, and now Brazil.
Yeah, I mean, I think the public is becoming very aware that there is powers that are greater than our nation that are seeking to influence the entire world. The fact that all of these NATO countries are undergoing exactly the same type of regime changes and the same kind of censorship laws at the same time is not by accident. There is someone or some bodies out there that are pulling strings and changing the way that we interact with our leaders. And it's a serious matter. Who and why, those are bigger questions. But I'm sure some people out there have their own theories.
Right. So Trevor, what's next for you? Are you going to throw in the towel, or do you have some other strategies to push back on this?
Right. So, what I did I confronted this issue in court. I stopped filing income tax statements is what I did, because I thought that was the least criminal act, I guess, to put it that way, that I could do to enter the legal system. And it turned out that it's kind of the most historically justifiable conduct as well, is that the confronting abuse of power and corruption by disputing the income tax is being done by Robin Hood and Jesus Christ and the American Revolution and the French Revolution. They've all did the same thing. So it accidentally turned out to be the sort of the correct course of action. But so I went through there and I disclosed my experience of a failure in the rule of law throughout the legal system to the Supreme Court of BC here in Nelson. And I asked for a writ of mandamus from the Minister of Justice, which is an order of the court for a minister to do his duty to protect the public and ensure the administration is in compliance with the law, which I knew it wasn't because he wasn't responding to the charter complaint, the enforcement procedure. And I detailed all that in the court. And then the decision of the judge was due on February 14th, 2022. And that was the day that the Minister of Justice enforced the Emergencies Act. I attended court. The judge didn't show up. And that was where that left. Eventually, the judge did show up and made a decision, and she called my evidence irrelevant, just to get me out of the way. I appealed that decision. I went to the BC Court of Appeal, and I brought this issue up again, and they called it a conspiracy theory that has no basis in reality. So now everything I say in the BC legal system can be dismissed as a conspiracy theory. It doesn't reflect reality. So essentially I have no ability to enforce anything or protect myself from anything in BC. And I kind of knew that already because they claimed the discretion to ignore all my evidence. So this really just confirmed my position, was that Canadians don't have any rights in the legal system if they can ignore all our evidence. So then I kind of was stuck a little bit. I ended up going to jail for about 3 months on a separate kind of matter. But because I had no rights, I couldn't enforce it, and they just ignored me. And so then you're right. I didn't know what to do until Justice Mosley declared that the Emergencies Act by David Lametti was illegal. And so just last week, I applied for intervener status at the Federal Court of Appeal to submit my evidence, which discloses that the Minister of Justice knew that he wasn't in compliance with the law. He knew he wasn't protecting the public, and he had actually written to me, and in his reasoning to me, he lied about his duties and he lied about the state of the law. And I called him on it, and he just didn't respond further. So that goes to the claim of the Minister of Justice, both at the POEC committee and in Parliament, that he was operating in good faith. He wasn't operating in good faith, and I can prove that because he lied. So now that evidence is before the federal court. They accepted my submission. They haven't ruled on whether they will let me in as an intervener. The Attorney General of Canada, who is the Minister of Justice, they're disputing it. So they're, I guess, at this point in time, writing up argument for why my evidence shouldn't be submitted, which will be interesting to hear. And then we'll see what the judge says about whether they let the evidence in or not. And to me, it really, one way or the other, it doesn't matter. If they reject the evidence, it says that they don't want to hear what Canadians have to say. And if they accept the evidence, then it's pretty darn damning of the conduct of the Minister of Justice. So we're going to get some answers for Canada one way or the other.
It's pretty impressive stuff. And what's your background? Are you a lawyer by profession, or did you just learn this stuff?
I'm very passionate about this. I started reading kind of that kind of philosophy kind of stuff in about 15, 16. And I was really interested in legal studies and politics through high school. And actually at university, in grade 12, I did 18th century French history as one of my subjects, which is all about absolute power. It's about the last of the divine right of kings and the French Revolution in 1789, where the uprising took power from the aristocracy and the king, which is basically your lawyers and the prime minister. So we're seeing a repeat of events that happened hundreds of years ago. And so I did do 2 years of law school after high school, and decided that I didn't want to become a lawyer, and I was more interested in outdoor adventures. And I spent the last 30 years in the outdoor industry here in Canada, skiing and stuff like that. And then, so this is kind of a turning of the circle, right? It's returning back to my roots, and I'm pretty happy to be doing the job, and I'm very fortunate to have support of a number of people in my community financially to be able to take this on. And I've taken it very seriously and invested the last 3 years investigating the public interest in our legal system.
Mr. Holsworth, do you have any advice or suggestions for anybody who's in a similar boat as you?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's difficult. But, the same kind of things: education, learning about the processes, not accepting what you're told, investigating for yourself. As soon as you trust someone else, you're giving away part of your power. So yeah, you can get legal advice from a lawyer. You can get all this stuff. You can get books. You want to educate yourself. And then the need to engage in our legal system or in our political system is obviously becoming important to all Canadians. And we're trying to work out solutions at this point in time. And I think we just need to engage in the discussion and be conscientious citizens. And
is there any way that people can help you out? Do you have a donation page, or if you want to do a plug for a book? I haven't gone that donation kind of thing. I'm trying to stick with just it being totally, I've got no financial interest in this matter. I'm doing it because it's important to me, and I believe it's important to Canadians. But I believe it's really important for Canadians to be informed. I would highly recommend that they visit fundamentaljustice.com, and you can see my arguments there. All the evidence that I've talked about is presented there, all the substacks.
are presented there. My experiences in the legal system are all documented. And like I say, I am on Twitter, and I appreciate a follower on that. And please communicate with me if you have experiences that you'd like to share. You can email me or contact me on Twitter. The more that we get together, we can support each other, and we can understand how to improve the system and what problems to look out for in the system. And that's really what I'm doing at this point in time. And hopefully we'll see some changes happening here shortly.
Trevor, apologies if you already said this, but what is your email for people to contact you?
Sure. It's on the website, but it's fundamentaljustice@gmail.com. So fundamental justice, all one word. And then fundamentaljustice.com is all one word as well. And it's got everything there. But thank you, Payman.
No, thank you for coming on.
All the bases there. Great job.
It's not my first rodeo.
Yeah. Oh, I can see that.
Well, I'm going to hold you over until after the episode, but Mr. Holsworth, I want to thank you very much for coming on and sharing your story with us.
Oh, thank you very much, Payman. Great questions, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Anytime. Bye, guys.